So today, before we get into it, I wanted to share with you. Last month, I attended a discipleship conference in North Chicago. Got to go there with Devin Garcia. And what took me by surprise was that the first session on discipleship wasn't about discipleship at all. The host spent the entire first session inviting those leaders who were disciple makers into looking deeply at our own hearts and our own walk with God. One statement that I wrote down in that early opening session was this: every great movement of God starts not by moving, but by sitting with God. And what we were being reminded of is, hey, as you're about to approach this subject of disciple making, let's talk first about your own heart as a disciple. Because sometimes while we're in the midst of trying to do good works for God, we miss the greatest work of all, being with God. And that theme is going to be central to our passage and the message this morning. And here's what we're going to try to come back to moment after moment in the message today, is that Jesus values our being with him more than our doing for him. So last week we were in the opening verses of Mark 3 where Jesus healed a man with a withered hand, and that whole event ended with a group of religious leaders so upset that they wanted to kill Jesus. That was how verse 6 ended, and we're going to pick it up in our reading this morning with verse number 7. Mark chapter 3, verse number 7. Says Jesus withdrew. Remember, people are now wanting to plot to kill him. So Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him, for he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. So we're working our way through the Gospel of Mark in case this is your first time with us or the first time in a long time. And we've already seen in the Gospel of Mark large crowds coming to Jesus to be healed. So this is nothing new except for that list of places in verse number 8. What we probably wouldn't catch with just a normal casual reading is Jesus's influence has now moved beyond the Jews and into the towns of the Gentiles. That means this Jewish rabbi, Jesus, who had a number of Jews following him, are now being joined by quote unquote unclean Gentiles. Look at verse number 11. It says, whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. Again, as we've journeyed through Mark, this is not the first time Jesus has silenced a demon. And we're like, well, why would he silence someone who's going to tell people he's the Son of God? Don't you want people to know that? But I would love for you to consider this. Would you want a demon to be your character witness? Would you want a tormenting spirit to point to people to say, he's the way? Right? So Jesus is going to silence these demons because he already has a plan on who is going to tell others about him. Who's going to tell others he is the Son of God? Not demons, but disciples. So look at verse 13. It says, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he named Peter; James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder; Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So we're going to take just a moment. We're going to talk about these 12 disciples, and then we're going to go back to verses 13 through 15, where the main portion of our message is going to be. But let's talk about these 12 disciples for just a moment. Why did Jesus pick 12? If you're a Bible student, you know that the number 12 is significant because 12 represents the covenant community, the covenant family of Yahweh. There were 12 tribes of Israel. And those 12 tribes made up the covenant community, the covenant family of Yahweh. And I'd love to get in deep into this, but we're not going to have time. So by selecting 12 disciples, Jesus was signaling that he's creating a new covenant family. This is a new covenant community. The old covenant, the 12 tribes of Israel, they were a community, they were a covenant community through the laws of Moses at Mount Sinai. That's when they entered their covenant with Yahweh. Jesus is going to, at some point, he's going to tell them that his blood is the new wine of a new covenant. And his blood, that new wine, is not going to fit into the old wineskins. So now there's this new covenant community, which means, and I think at some point these religious leaders began to understand this, that old community is going to be pushed to the side as a new community arises. And think about this, the religious leaders, these high priests, they're set aside for a group of fishermen, tax collectors, and tradesmen. That didn't make them very happy at all. We say, why was the new covenant community even necessary? Because the laws of Moses that were given by God at Sinai, they never brought the relationship that Yahweh desired. Right? Think with me. Sometimes we think the law was bad. The law was not bad. The law is perfect, the book of Psalms says. It converts the soul. The law is sweet to our taste, like honey to our lips. The law wasn't bad. It was the way Israel responded to the law. They either kept the law out of duty while giving their love to other gods and other things and not to Yahweh, but they were doing their duty. Or they kept the law and love themselves, lifting themselves up out of pride, saying, look at what I'm doing. I'm keeping the law, when the whole time the law was meant to drive them, because what is the greatest command? Love Yahweh with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The law was all about relationship, but Israel had taken the law and divorced love for God from the law. And so when Yahweh says, I will be your God and you will be my people, they're like, yeah, that's okay. We'll keep the law, but we'll follow these gods. Or we'll keep the law and we'll make ourselves more valuable than even you. And so with these 12 disciples, Jesus was signaling to the religious leaders, your time is coming to a close. Things are going to change. This is why they hated Jesus. But there's one other detail in this verse behind me as Mark is telling or introducing the disciples. He promptly says, long before the end of Jesus' life, he promptly says, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. He's signaling to the reader, right? We know Jesus' story, but you got to understand, there were people who sat down to read Mark for the first time. And as they're reading Mark for the first time, and Jesus is choosing, he just silenced the demons. Now he chooses 12 disciples, and they're reading, oh, he chose this guy and this guy and this guy. And he chose this guy. And this is the one who's going to betray him. It just takes us back to relationships. Jesus chooses this man to come be with him, and that man he chooses to be with him is the one who's going to betray him. And how does he do it? He does it with a kiss. Judas's kiss of betrayal is an important reminder that public affection for Jesus is not the same as personal allegiance to Jesus. It's very easy to gather in a large crowd like this and worship Jesus. But I think he finds so much more joy when we are in private adoring him. It's easy to fool people in a setting like this, just probably like Judas did. But Jesus knew from the beginning that Judas was going to betray him. And he knows our hearts too. But the betrayal of Judas is also a reminder that simply being around Jesus or being around followers of Jesus is not the mark of a true Jesus follower. See, Jesus followers, they apply his teachings to their lives. They obey his spirit with joy. And they follow his example. I'm thrilled, and I love standing in the lobby every Sunday and shaking hands with people, and I'm so glad every single one of you are here today. But it's really important for me to remind you, being in a room full of Christians doesn't make you a Christian. Walking into a location where there's a group of Jesus followers doesn't make us Jesus followers. It is our own personal devotion to Jesus that matters. Because one of the 12 betrayed him. Okay, so let's jump back to verses 13 through 15. The big picture of these verses behind me is that Jesus chose some disciples and he sent them out to preach and to cast out demons. But just like the discipleship conference that I attended, the initial focus is not on doing for Jesus, but on being with Jesus. Notice how verse 13 starts out behind that Jesus went up on a mountainside. He was just with a crowd by the seashore, which means Jesus walks away from the crowd to go up to a mountain alone, meaning he walked away from people who had gathered so that he would help them. You say, well, if there were people there for Jesus to care for, why would he walk away from them? Does he not care about them? Does he not have compassion on them? And of course, we know that's not true about Jesus. So what is happening here? Jesus left the needy crowd because being with God, it must always precede doing for God. Well, we wouldn't see this in Mark's gospel, but Luke's gospel is going to show us just one little piece of information that is really helpful to understand. Let me show it to you. In Luke chapter 6, it tells us that when Jesus went up on the mountainside, he went up on the mountainside to pray all night. We didn't see that in Mark. In Mark, we just see that Jesus goes up a mountainside and then he calls them. But Luke tells us he went up on that mountain and he spent all night in prayer to God before he called his disciples unto him. What does that tell us? It tells us that Jesus was well aware of how much he was needed by others, but his priority was how much he needed the Father. I know sometimes we question, why would Jesus pray if Jesus is God, right? Sometimes like, why is that? We have to remember that, yes, Jesus was God, but he emptied himself of his divine attributes. And at his baptism, he was anointed by the Spirit of God, and he lived as a Spirit-filled human. Because he wanted to provide to us an example of how to live as Spirit filled humans. Jesus didn't go up to the mountain and say, I already know what to do. I'm just going to hang out here with you. He went up and he asked the Father to help him know, who am I supposed to serve with? Who are the 12 that I need in this new covenant family? And so what do we learn from Jesus in this moment is that the greatest priority of the kingdom of God is being with the King. And we can't miss that. I think sometimes, like, when we think, what's the most important thing I can do for Jesus? I'll tell you, spend time with him. Just be with him. You notice if we go back to this passage, how much Mark prioritizes relationships. Watch, read this with me. Jesus went up on a mountainside. Remember, he went up on the mountain to be with the Father, relationship, and called to him, relation, those he wanted, and they came to him, relation. And he appointed 12 that they might be with him, relation. And then finally we come to that he might send them to preach and to cast out demons. And we might think the great work that these disciples were called to do was to go preach the gospel, tell the good news about who Jesus is, and drive out demons. No, the greatest work the disciples had was to be with Jesus. The order is not random. Jesus wasn't hiring 12 guys to do a work. He was calling 12 men to be with him. And it would only be after being with him for years that he would send them out to do the work. And why? Because as we already said, Jesus values our being with him more than our doing for him. But let's be honest, how many of us, we really value what we do for Jesus more than being with him? And this is not a criticism. This is just a reality. I'm going to tell you why. Because people can see when we do stuff for Jesus. And they can't see the time we spend with Jesus. And again, I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm just being real here. We could show up on a Sunday and we could serve and serve and serve. And you know what everybody's going to do? They're going to look at our lives and say, oh, they must have a great relationship with Jesus because they're serving him. When the reality is, it may have been days, weeks, maybe even months since we've actually been with Jesus. And if you actually wanted to see the health of our relationship of Jesus, it is not strong. It is very weak. In fact, it's tattered and barely holding on because all we do is, I don't mean this unkindly in any way. I'm just trying to encourage us. If we just serve and serve and serve and serve, the appearance that we are great with Jesus is there while the inside is crumbling away. And so I just want to share with you a couple of reasons this morning on why it's important for us to spend time, as these disciples were called, to be with Jesus. First, because when we're alone with Jesus, our hearts are filled. Our hearts are filled. Have you ever found yourself surprised at the way you reacted with a cutting comment to your spouse? Like, wow, I wasn't even expecting to say that. Or the way you reacted to a child who didn't do what you wanted them to do, or how you can get overly emotional about a social media post or a news article. Just finding yourself surprised, like how much this little thing really bothered me. What's happening? In that moment, even though we often don't recognize it, we are expecting others to do for us what only Jesus can, which is to fill us, to fill our emptiness. And the problem is When we minimize our relationship with Jesus, it often results in maximizing the faults of others. It's like, you know, that there are times where your spouse is late and it bothers you so much, you get an argument because they make you late. And then the next time they make you late, it's like no big deal. Sometimes your children will react one way and man, it just irritates the fire out of you. And then they could do the same thing and it really doesn't bother you. What's the difference? It's whether your love tank is full or not. See, when our love tanks are full, we're not looking to others to fill it. We're not dependent on others to make things right. This is why we've got to go to Jesus, because it's in spending time with Jesus that we're reminded of how much we are loved. He loved me so much, he laid his life down for me. I was a sinner and he rescued me and he redeemed me and he restored me to a relationship with the Father. And as we spend time with Jesus, our love tanks are filled, so we're no longer dependent on others to fill for us. In fact, what happens is when we spend time with Jesus, our love tanks are filled so that it can overflow and we can offer love to people, even to those who don't need it or who don't deserve it. We've got to spend time with Jesus, because our hearts need to be filled with Jesus. So we can offer kindness instead of cruelty. So we can offer patience instead of... So we can be tender instead of rude. But it all begins by spending time with the one who loves you. Secondly, when we're alone with Jesus, our priorities are ordered. Our priorities are ordered. When Jesus called the disciples to come to him, they had to leave that crowd behind. Remember, it said he's calling them to him, so they came to him. And when Jesus calls us into a relationship with him, there's always a cost of something that has to be left behind. Those disciples had to leave their fishing boats, their tax collectors' booths, because following Jesus became their greatest priority. When McKenna walked in here this morning to be baptized today, she had to leave behind fear, because following Jesus was more important to her. Now, not everyone's willing to do that. There's a story in Mark chapter 10 of a man that's known as the rich young ruler. And this rich young ruler came to Jesus and asked him about eternal life. And Jesus tells them, they have this long conversation. And finally, Jesus says to him in verse 21, he looked at him and he loved him. Starts with a relationship, right? Starts with a relationship. He looked at him and he loved him. One thing you lack, he said. Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. At this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth. Jesus begins with his love, and then he says, come follow me, just like he said to the other disciples. But this man was different. There was something that gripped him so much that he wasn't willing to walk away in order to follow Jesus. And what was it? It was his wealth. It was his treasures. But he held on to his treasures, but his treasures didn't bring him joy. Holding on left him sad. We all live with priorities in life. Some of us, our priorities are what prevents us from truly being with Jesus. I have no doubt for some in the world, the thing holding them back from Jesus is wealth, just like this man. But it might just be something as simple as time on streaming services, time on social media, prioritizing sports or a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or making the pursuit of that career the most important thing in our lives. But here's what I do know for all of us. Time isn't what stops us from being with Jesus. Priorities are. There are many things in this life that matter, But nothing matters more than spending time with Jesus, because as we do, all these things that demand our attention, they kind of shuffle into the rightful place because we're reminded of who we're with. Last week, we got to attend Gracie Hollum's wedding, and every time I go to a wedding, there's a renewed sense of love for my wife, because I sit there and I listen to these vows that are being given, and it reminds me of what I promised and what I was also promised in return. And there's always a renewal in my heart when I sit through a wedding. When our family gets together, I never leave the time when our family's together and say, and without saying, man, I wish we could do this more often. Because it's the time with them that reminds me how valuable those relationships are. And being in the presence of Jesus does the same thing. You will never leave a prayer meeting and say, what a waste of time. But there are many in our life that will keep us from attending a prayer meeting. When we're alone with Jesus, our priorities are ordered. Third, when we're alone with Jesus, our purposes are renewed. I've told you this before, but our family moved from Northwest Indiana to Virginia in 2017. When we did, it was the middle of the winter time, and so our boys were in the middle of a basketball season in Northwest Indiana. When we went to Virginia, they immediately joined the Christian school boys team where they enrolled, and they were a little bit more than halfway done with their season. Very first game that we were at was a home game, and the coach, because I was the pastor there, he invited me to sit on the bench with the team. And so I did. I sat on the bench, but I sat way at the end because I didn't want to make these guys feel like I was coming in and trying to, do anything. So I sat at the end, and boy, not a couple minutes into the game, and there was when I say a really bad call, it was a really bad call right in front of me. And so I let the referee know, like, he didn't step on the line. Well, they went back up the court, and when they came back down, that referee was standing in front of me again. And I just kind of wanted him to know that he had made a bad call and that I had seen it because I was sitting right there. And so I said to him again, I'm like, hey, he was not out of bounds. And he turned around, he looked at me because he doesn't know who I am. I'm brand new there, right? He's like, are you a coach? I said, no, I'm the pastor. He said, well, then be quiet. The next morning, a man in our church who is also in the referees association called me and he said, what happened last night? And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, there's already a complaint against you as the new pastor for having poor sportsmanship. I'm gonna be honest with you. When I heard those words, my heart dropped. I literally was devastated. Like, I just realized by me trying to point out that a kid didn't step on the line in a basketball game, that doesn't matter. I may have just lost the opportunity to speak to this man about his eternal soul one day. And you could ask my wife. I used to be somebody who would, yell and stuff during sports games. You could ask her. I don't say anything anymore. That one phone call is all it took for me to realize I didn't move my family to Virginia to point out the bad calls of a referee during a basketball game. I moved my family to Virginia so that I could preach about a good king to as many people as I possibly can. And if my attitude is going to get in the way of being able to tell people about Jesus, then I better shut my mouth and I better get my attitude in check. And I could sit and I can watch a game with as many bad calls as I see, and it doesn't matter. I'll walk up to the ref afterwards, tell him how glad I was that he was there. Thank you for being here. And if you ever are looking for a church home, we'd love to have you. That's why I moved to Virginia. Not to correct these guys. And I had to understand that my greatest purpose in life And your greatest purpose in life is not to fix everybody else's problems that you see. Our greatest purpose in life is to point people with problems to the one who can solve them. Our greatest purpose is to live in such a way that we have developed a reputation that when somebody is in need, we can step into that need and they don't have to look at us and say, but I heard your mouth. I heard your attitude. You've been a jerk. I don't want anything to do with you or anybody you're talking about. We need to live in such a way that our greatest priority is to point people to the King. And it is in being with Jesus that this takes place. Because it's in being with Jesus that our hearts are shaped to love people as Jesus loves people. I don't think he would sit on the bench and argue with the referee. It's in being with Jesus that we see people as he sees them. It's in being with Jesus as we begin to be able to live as he lived. It's in being with him that our purposes are renewed. And then finally, when we're alone with Jesus, that's when our lives are transformed. Think with me. Jesus was already preaching to the multitudes. He was already casting out demons. Why did he need to call 12 guys to do the same thing? It was already happening. Jesus called these 12 men to him because he wanted to transform their lives from being fishermen to being spirit-filled preachers who would continue to do the work long after Jesus was done. And he knew that transformation would only happen if he called them first to be with him. And so that call was, I'm going to choose 12 and I'm appointing you. And here's what I'm appointing you to do. Be with me. You know, going back to that discipleship conference, there's one church leader, I remember, who raised their hand and they talked about the struggle of that many churches face. Like, hey, we don't have enough volunteers to try to do the things that we need to do. And we talked about it there. We know why. Like, most Christians attend church to become better people, not busier people. Get that, right? But I think there's one thing that a lot of Christians miss. The natural progression of being with Jesus is to go serve others like Jesus. It's the natural progression. Jesus didn't call these disciples to be with him indefinitely. He called them to be with him as long until they had the chance to understand who he was, and so that they could go do the same things that he did. I want you to think with me. If we knew that Jesus attended PCC today, would you expect him to quietly slip in the back, not talk to many people, and then quickly leave after the service? Would you be surprised if that's what Jesus did? I mean, I would. That doesn't sound like him, right? We'd expect Jesus to be at the front door greeting, walking through the hallways, serving with a smile, praying with anybody he sees that looks a little bit discouraged, worshiping with his hands in the air, sharing and being welcome. That's right. That's who Jesus would be if he was here. Well, if we've been with Jesus, shouldn't that be how we act when we're here? I wonder if we slip in and slip out simply because we haven't really been with Jesus. So we've not been formed more like Jesus this week. You know, being a door greeter, it's not about opening a door. It's about helping people find a place of belonging. We're so glad you're here. Serving in kids ministry, it's not about occupying some children for an hour. It's about forming the hearts of the next generation of Jesus followers. What a joy that should be. And I'll tell you this, I know that this church is full of people who love to serve. But I'll also encourage you, if you're not serving, you're missing out. And I don't mean you're missing out on fulfilling that transformed purpose of why we come to be with Jesus. And I realize there's all kinds of people. Some of you have been in churches where you're worn out and you've served. And hey, listen, I understand that. We all have smartphones in our pockets that can do amazing things as long as they keep getting plugged in to the source. But if you just keep using this phone over and over and over and over, at some point it's not going to be able to do anything. And that's when we serve and serve and serve and serve without plugging into Jesus, eventually we're going to wear out too. So make sure you're plugging your life into Jesus, because he's got a mission for us to accomplish. He's calling us to him to prepare us to serve like him. And the cool thing about Jesus is when he sends us out from him, we actually don't leave him. The Great Commission starts off, go into all the world and preach the gospel, and it ends with, and I will be with you to the end of the age. Because when he gives us his Spirit, he's telling us, you'll always be with me. So if serving the King has left you weary, take time to sit in his presence today. If something is hindering your walk with Jesus, realign your priorities. And if sitting with Jesus has renewed you, share that love with someone. And I'll close with this. If we make space for God, he will fill it. If we make space for God, he will fill it. I just want to close today by giving you a little bit of time to just simply be with Jesus. So would you mind just bowing your head where you're at? Just closing your eyes. I would love for you to just take a moment and tell Jesus what you love most about him. Just tell him what you love. And then I want you to listen and say, Jesus, what do you love most about me? I want you to hear his voice. I want you to hear him tell you how much he loves you. It has nothing to do with what you do. It has everything to do with who you are. Would you tell him your greatest fear? What is it? What is it that has control of you right now? What's the greatest fear in your life? And say, Jesus, can you remind me how you're going to walk with me through this? You're not going to leave me. Ask him, Jesus, what's getting in the way of a deeper relationship in our life? What is it that's the greatest interference to our relationship? Just listen to what he has to say. Are you willing to do something about that? Will you give him more time? Will you give him some space? Ask him, Jesus, what do you want me to learn more about you this week? More about your grace? your forgiveness, the way you love the unlovable, your limitless mercy. Ask him for an opportunity this week to be able to show that to someone. I'm learning about the grace of Jesus, and I'm going to offer grace to you. And one last thing before we close. Ask Jesus right now for someone you can pray for. First person that comes to your mind, just pray for them. And could I encourage you on your drive, maybe when you have a quiet time, regularly ask Jesus who you can pray for and pray for them right away. And I encourage you to let them know.